The bustling courthouse in downtown Chicago fell silent as a young man in an ill-fitting suit walked through its marble halls. At just 17, Brian Chen looked out of place among the seasoned attorneys rushing past with their leather briefcases and perfectly pressed suits. His second-hand blazer hung slightly loose on his shoulders, and his tie wasn't quite straight, but his eyes sparkled with determination. This wasn't where Brian had planned to spend his senior year of high school. Most of his classmates were worried about prom dates and college applications, but he had bigger concerns. His grandfather's small restaurant, a beloved neighborhood institution for over 40 years, was facing closure due to a predatory property developer's fraudulent claims. When no lawyer would take their case due to the powerful developer's influence, Brian spent countless nights studying law books, watching court proceedings, and learning everything he could about property rights and contract law. His family thought he was crazy when he announced he would represent his grandfather in court, but they had run out of options. As Brian approached Courtroom 7B, his hands trembled slightly while clutching his meticulously prepared documents. The security guard at the door gave him a puzzled look, probably wondering if he was lost. Inside, the atmosphere was intimidating. Dark wood panels lined the walls, and the morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating the judge's bench where Judge Harrison Peterson sat with an air of authority that made Brian's throat go dry. Case number 2025, CV 4872, Chen vs. Metropolitan Development Corporation, the court clerk announced. The opposing counsel, a distinguished attorney in his 50s named Richard Walsh, smirked when he saw Brian approach the plaintiff's table. Judge Peterson peered over his reading glasses, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Young man, are you lost?" "This is a courtroom, not a classroom," Judge Peterson said, his voice dripping with condescension. A few chuckles echoed through the gallery. Brian stood straight, fighting to keep his voice steady. "No, Your Honor. I'm Brian Chen, representing the plaintiff, James Chen, in this case. I'm appearing pro se on behalf of my grandfather under Illinois Supreme Court Rule 707. Judge Peterson's eyebrows shot up. "This is not a school mock trial, son. Where is your attorney?" "Your Honor, while I may be young, I've thoroughly studied the relevant laws and precedents. I'm prepared to present our case," Brian replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. The judge's face reddened. "This is preposterous. I won't have my courtroom turned into a circus. Do you even understand the complexity of property law?" Instead of cowering, Brian opened his carefully organized binder. "If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to cite Henderson v. Williams, 2022, where the Illinois Supreme Court held that age is not a barrier to pro se representation as long as the party demonstrates competency in understanding the legal matters at hand." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Peterson's mocking smile faded as Brian continued, "Furthermore, I've prepared a comprehensive brief addressing the fraudulent misrepresentation in the property transfer agreement, with specific reference to the altered dates on documents submitted by the defendant." In the gallery, Brian's grandfather sat quietly, his weathered hands clasped together, watching his grandson stand up to the powerful forces that threatened their family legacy. The restaurant wasn't just a business, it was the story of an immigrant's American dream, built one dumpling at a time. Mr. Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair as Brian pulled out a series of documents. "Your Honor, if I may draw your attention to Exhibit A, which clearly shows the original property agreement dates were altered using digital manipulation. I've included a forensic analysis report confirming this finding." Judge Peterson leaned forward, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by growing interest. The young man before him wasn't just quoting law books, he was presenting a well-researched, methodically organized case. As Brian laid out the evidence of the developer's fraudulent activities, the judge's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine attention. The morning light continued to stream through the courthouse windows, illuminating Brian's face as he spoke with increasing confidence. This was just the beginning of a case that would not only change his life but would also challenge everyone's preconceptions about what a 17-year-old from a humble background could achieve when fighting for justice. In the back of the courtroom, other attorneys had stopped to watch, their phones forgotten in their hands. Some wore expressions of disbelief, others of admiration. But Brian noticed none of this. His focus was entirely on presenting his grandfather's case, on fighting for what was right, on proving that sometimes the most powerful legal mind could come in the most unexpected package. The story of what happened next would soon spread through legal circles across the city, but for now, Brian Chen stood in courtroom 7B, ready to show the world that justice knows no age limit. As the first day of the trial progressed, Brian's initial presentation had caught everyone off guard, but the real challenge was just beginning. During the lunch recess, he sat alone on a wooden bench in the courthouse corridor, reviewing his notes while eating a simple sandwich his mother had packed. The same sandwich his grandfather used to make for him when he helped at the restaurant after school. A shadow fell across his papers. Looking up, Brian found Attorney Walsh standing over him, his expensive suit casting a long shadow in the hallway light. "Kid, you're in way over your head," Walsh said, his voice low and measured. "Why don't you let the adults handle this? I'm sure we can reach an arrangement that would benefit your family." Brian met his gaze steadily, remembering the tears in his grandfather's eyes when they received the fraudulent eviction notice. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Walsh, but I'll take my chances in court." He returned to his notes, his hands steady despite his racing heart. Back in the courtroom, Brian began methodically presenting evidence that would shake the foundation of Metropolitan Development's case. He pulled up digital records showing a pattern of similar fraudulent activities in other neighborhoods, carefully connecting the dots for Judge Peterson. "Your Honor, the evidence shows that Metropolitan Development has targeted family-owned businesses across 3 different districts," Brian explained, his voice clear and confident. Each case followed the same pattern of altered documents and manipulated dates. The gallery had grown larger after the lunch break, filled with curious attorneys and law students who had heard whispers about the teenage legal prodigy. Among them sat Mrs. Park, owner of the Korean grocery store next to his grandfather's restaurant. She had lost her lease to Metropolitan 6 months ago. Her presence reminded Brian of exactly what he was fighting for. Judge Peterson, who had started the day dismissing Brian, now leaned forward with interest as the young man presented a digital forensics report. The metadata from these documents shows systematic alterations made using specialized software registered to an IP address within Metropolitan Development's corporate network. Walsh's face tightened as he stood to object. "Your Honor, this is speculation. The plaintiff's evidence is circumstantial at best." But even as he spoke, his usual confidence wavered. Brian was ready. He pulled out his next exhibit, sworn affidavits from former Metropolitan employees. "Your Honor, these testimonies corroborate the digital evidence. They detail specific instances where dates were altered on property documents under direct orders from Metropolitan's executive team." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom windows as Brian continued presenting his case. His grandfather sat in the gallery, watching with a mixture of pride and anxiety as his youngest grandchild stood toe-to-toe with one of the city's most formidable corporate lawyers. During a brief recess, Brian overheard 2 veteran attorneys discussing the case. "Did you see how he handled Walsh's objection about the digital evidence?" one whispered. "Some of my associates could learn from this kid." But not everyone was impressed. As Brian walked to the water fountain, he passed a group of Metropolitan Development executives huddled in conversation. Their whispers stopped as he approached, replaced by cold stares. One of them, a man with steel-gray hair, made a phone call as Brian passed by. That evening, as Brian prepared to leave the courthouse, his phone buzzed with an anonymous text: "Drop the case now, or your grandfather's restaurant won't be the only thing your family loses." His hand tightened around the phone, but he took a deep breath, remembering his grandfather's words about courage in the face of injustice. At home that night, Brian sat at his desk, surrounded by law books and case files. His high school textbooks lay untouched in his backpack. He'd have to pull an all-nighter to finish his physics homework. The desk lamp cast a warm glow as he reviewed tomorrow's arguments, the sounds of his mother cooking dinner drifting up from the kitchen below. His younger sister poked her head into his room. "There's something you should see," she said, holding up her tablet. On the screen was a local news website with the headline, "Teen Attorney Takes on Real Estate Giant, David vs. Goliath in Chicago Courthouse." Brian groaned. He hadn't wanted media attention, it could complicate the case. But as he scrolled through the article, he noticed something interesting. Other small business owners were coming forward with similar stories about Metropolitan Development's practices. His phone rang. It was Mrs. Park. "Brian, my daughter found something in our old lease documents," she said, her voice excited. "I think it proves they used the same fraud scheme on us." As midnight approached, Brian's desk was covered with new evidence and testimonies. The case was growing bigger than just his grandfather's restaurant. It was becoming a fight for all the small business owners who had been victimized by Metropolitan schemes. He glanced at a photo on his desk, his grandfather on opening day of the restaurant 40 years ago, young and full of dreams. Tomorrow would be crucial. Metropolitan's legal team would be prepared for him now, and Judge Peterson's initial skepticism might return if Brian showed any weakness. The next morning, Brian arrived early to the courthouse, his shoes echoing in the empty halls. He carried an extra box of documents, evidence from other business owners who had reached out overnight. As he set up his materials in the courtroom, he noticed Judge Peterson watching him thoughtfully from his chamber's doorway. The judge approached, his formal robes rustling. "Mr. Chen," he said, his tone markedly different from yesterday's condescension, "I want you to know that while I may have misjudged you initially, this court will continue to hold you to the same standards as any other attorney." Brian nodded, "Thank you, Your Honor. That's all I ask for, a fair chance to present our case." As other people began filing into the courtroom, Brian straightened his tie and reviewed his notes one final time. Today would be about more than just saving his grandfather's restaurant. It would be about standing up to corporate bullies who thought they could exploit hardworking families with impunity. The morning sun once again streamed through the tall windows, but today it felt different. Today, Brian Chen wasn't just a 17-year-old in an ill-fitting suit. He was the voice for everyone who had ever been told they were too young, too inexperienced, or too powerless to fight for justice. The third day of the trial began with an unexpected twist. As Brian prepared his materials for cross-examination, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in his mid-30s, wearing a slightly rumpled suit, hurried in and approached Brian's table. He introduced himself as Thomas Reynolds, a former legal consultant for Metropolitan Development. "I saw the news coverage," Thomas whispered urgently. "I've been keeping quiet for too long. I have documents, internal memos that prove the systematic fraud. They made me sign an NDA when I left, but I can't stay silent anymore." Before Brian could respond, Attorney Walsh strode over. "Any evidence not submitted during discovery is inadmissible, Your Honor," he announced loudly, having overheard the exchange. "This is an obvious attempt to circumvent proper legal procedure." Judge Peterson raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Chen, are you planning to introduce new evidence?" Brian's mind raced, remembering the rules of civil procedure he'd studied. "Your Honor, under Rule 26(e), we have an obligation to supplement discovery if we obtain new relevant information. I request a brief recess to review these documents and properly submit them to the court." The judge nodded, impressed by the quick citation of proper procedure. 30 minutes, Mr. Chen. Use them wisely." In a small conference room, Brian quickly scanned through Thomas's documents. His hands trembled slightly as he realized what he was holding: internal emails discussing the date adjustment strategy, and meetings about targeting specific immigrant-owned businesses that were less likely to fight back. When court resumed, Brian's cross-examination of Metropolitan's chief financial officer took an unexpected turn. "Mr. Phillips," Brian began, holding up one of the new documents, "could you explain this email where you discuss, and I quote, adjusting dates as needed to expedite property acquisition?" The CFO's face paled. In the gallery, Thomas Reynolds sat quietly, his presence a silent testimony to the truth of the documents. Walsh jumped to his feet, objecting vigorously, but the evidence was properly submitted now, there was no legal basis to exclude it. As the afternoon progressed, Brian methodically connected the dots between the new evidence and the pattern of fraud they had established earlier. His grandfather watched from his usual spot, hands clasped tightly, as his grandson dismantled Metropolitan's defense piece by piece. During a brief recess, Brian received an unexpected visit from his high school principal. "Your teachers mentioned you've been struggling to keep up with assignments," she said kindly. "But they also say they've never been prouder of a student. We've decided to count your courtroom experience as credit for your civics and public speaking classes." Back in session, Brian faced his biggest challenge yet, cross-examining Richard Walsh himself. The veteran attorney had been forced to take the stand after Brian successfully argued that Walsh's own involvement in preparing the fraudulent documents made him a material witness. "Mr. Walsh," Brian began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "when did you first become aware of the systematic alteration of property documents at Metropolitan Development?" Walsh's practiced smile remained fixed, but his eyes darted nervously to his own legal team. "I was not aware of any systematic alterations, as you put it. Any discrepancies in dates were clerical errors." Brian pulled up an email on the courtroom screen. "Then could you explain this message from you to the CEO, dated March 15, discussing the need to accelerate property acquisitions through creative documentation?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. In the gallery, Mrs. Park clasped her hands over her mouth. Other business owners who had lost their properties leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of hope and vindication. As the afternoon wore on, Brian's cross-examination revealed layer after layer of corporate misconduct. He showed how Metropolitan had specifically targeted immigrant-owned businesses, assuming their limited English proficiency and unfamiliarity with the legal system would make them easier targets. "Your Honor," Brian concluded, his voice filled with quiet determination, "the evidence shows that Metropolitan Development didn't just commit fraud, they built their entire business model around exploiting vulnerable communities." Judge Peterson's expression had grown increasingly grave throughout the afternoon. Even some members of Metropolitan's legal team looked uncomfortable as the full scope of their company's actions came to light. During the final recess of the day, Brian stepped into the courthouse bathroom to splash water on his face. His reflection showed dark circles under his eyes from countless late nights of preparation. As he dried his hands, he heard the door open behind him. It was Thomas Reynolds. "I never thought I'd see someone finally stand up to them," he said quietly. "You know they're going to come after me for breaking that NDA." Brian straightened his tie. "Actually, under whistleblower protection laws, your NDA is unenforceable when reporting illegal activities. I've already filed for whistleblower protection on your behalf." Thomas smiled sadly. "You really did think of everything, didn't you?" As the day drew to a close, Brian gathered his materials while the last rays of sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows. His mother had texted to say she was making his favorite dinner, his grandfather's special recipe for beef noodle soup. The same dish they'd served at the restaurant on its opening day 40 years ago. In the corridor, he overheard two junior associates from Metropolitan's legal team discussing job applications. The company's reputation was already taking a hit, and nobody wanted to be associated with a firm exposed for systematic fraud. That evening, as Brian sat at his desk reviewing his notes for the next day, his sister brought him a stack of letters. Word of the case had spread, and other small business owners from across the city had written to share their stories of facing similar tactics from large developers. He picked up a framed photo of his grandfather standing proudly in front of the restaurant on opening day. Tomorrow would bring the closing arguments. The final chance to ensure justice wasn't just a word in law books but a real force that protected hard-working people who had risked everything to build their American dream. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like stars, reminding him of all the small businesses that lit up their neighborhoods, creating not just places of commerce but communities. Tomorrow, he would speak for all of them. The morning of closing arguments arrived with an unexpected development. As Brian walked up the courthouse steps, he noticed an unusual number of news vans parked outside. The story of the teenage attorney taking on a corporate giant had gone viral overnight, turning his grandfather's fight for justice into a symbol of hope for small business owners everywhere. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every bench was filled, with people standing along the walls. Brian spotted familiar faces, restaurant owners, shopkeepers, and families who had lost their businesses to metropolitan schemes. His high school debate teacher sat near the back, giving him an encouraging nod. Before proceedings began, Metropolitan's legal team made one last attempt to turn the tide. Walsh approached the bench with an emergency motion, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, we've prepared a settlement offer. We're willing to not only preserve Mr. Chen's restaurant but also provide substantial compensation." All eyes turned to Brian. The offer was tempting. It would guarantee his grandfather's restaurant's safety without the risk of an unfavorable verdict. But then he remembered Mrs. Park's tears when she had to close her grocery store, the other families who had lost everything, and Thomas Reynolds risking his career to expose the truth. "Your Honor," Brian stood, his voice clear and steady, "we respectfully decline the offer. This case isn't just about one restaurant anymore. It's about holding corporations accountable when they prey on hardworking people who built their American dreams from nothing." Judge Peterson nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Walsh. "The motion is noted. Proceed with closing arguments." Walsh went first, his years of experience showing in every carefully chosen word. He painted Metropolitan as a misunderstood company that had made some administrative mistakes but had ultimately contributed to urban development. He emphasized Brian's youth, subtly suggesting that inexperience had led him to see conspiracy where there was only confusion. When it was Brian's turn, he took a deep breath and approached the jury box. Gone was the nervous teenager from day one. In his place stood a young man who had found his voice fighting for justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "over the past days, you've seen two very different stories. Metropolitan's lawyers want you to believe this case is about simple clerical errors and misunderstandings. But the evidence tells a different story." He walked to his table and picked up his grandfather's original lease. "This document represents more than just a business agreement. It represents 40 years of early mornings preparing dumplings, late nights cleaning tables, and thousands of customers who became family. My grandfather signed this with the belief that in America, hard work and honesty matter more than power and money." Brian then displayed the falsified documents on the courtroom screen. Metropolitan didn't just change dates on papers. They changed people's lives. They turned 40 years of dreams into nightmares with a few keystrokes. They assumed that immigrant business owners wouldn't understand, wouldn't fight back, wouldn't find someone to speak for them in court. In the gallery, his grandfather wiped away tears as Brian continued. But they underestimated something fundamental about America. They underestimated that in this country, justice doesn't depend on how expensive your suit is or how many lawyers you can afford. Justice depends on truth, and the truth is on our side. He methodically reviewed the evidence, the forensic analysis of altered documents, Thomas Reynolds' testimony, the internal emails showing intentional targeting of immigrant businesses, and the pattern of fraud across multiple properties. "Your Honor," Brian turned to Judge Peterson, "Metropolitan's actions weren't mistakes. They were calculated decisions made by people who believed they were above the law. They believed their victims would be too afraid, too poor, or too powerless to fight back." His voice grew stronger as he continued, but they were wrong. Every person in this courtroom who lost their business to Metropolitan's fraud is proof that the American dream isn't just about success, it's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Brian addressed the defense's arguments. They want you to focus on my age, to question whether a 17-year-old could possibly understand the complexities of property law. But this case isn't complex at all. It's about right and wrong. It's about whether we'll allow powerful corporations to steal dreams from hardworking people through fraud and deception. As Brian concluded, the courtroom remained silent, his words hanging in the air. Your Honor, we're not just asking for justice for my grandfather's restaurant. We're asking for justice for every small business owner who was targeted, every family who lost their livelihood, and every future entrepreneur who deserves to know that in America, the law protects everyone equally. During the recess before the verdict, Brian sat in the courthouse hallway with his grandfather. The old man took his grandson's hand, his eyes filled with pride. No matter what happens, he said softly in Mandarin, you've already won. You stood up for what's right. News had spread beyond the courthouse. On his phone, Brian saw social media filling with stories from other business owners across the country who had faced similar tactics from large developers. What had started as one family's fight for their restaurant had become a movement. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable as Judge Peterson prepared to deliver his verdict. The Metropolitan executives sat stone-faced, their earlier confidence replaced by genuine concern. Thomas Reynolds nervously adjusted his tie, while Mrs. Park clutched her daughter's hand. Before announcing his decision, Judge Peterson looked directly at Brian. The same judge who had mocked him on the first day now saw something very different, not just a teenager in an ill-fitting suit, but a symbol of how justice could work when someone was brave enough to fight for it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as everyone waited for the words that would either validate Metropolitan's power or prove that sometimes, David really could defeat Goliath. Judge Peterson cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom. Every person leaned forward slightly, the tension almost tangible in the air. Brian felt his heart pounding but kept his expression calm, feeling his grandfather's trembling hand on his shoulder. In my 30 years on the bench, Judge Peterson began, I've seen countless cases of corporate disputes and property litigation. But rarely have I witnessed such a clear pattern of deliberate fraud and systematic exploitation. He paused, looking directly at Metropolitan's executives. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the fraud itself, but the calculated targeting of vulnerable communities. The judge lifted a document from his bench. The evidence presented by Mr. Chen isn't just compelling, it's overwhelming. The forensic analysis of altered documents, the internal communications showing intent, and the testimony of Mr. Reynolds paint a picture of corporate misconduct that cannot be ignored. Walsh started to rise, but Judge Peterson held up his hand. Let me be clear, this court finds that Metropolitan Development Corporation engaged in systematic fraud through document manipulation, intentional misrepresentation, and predatory practices targeting immigrant-owned businesses. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Brian remained still, hardly daring to breathe. Therefore, the judge continued, this court rules in favor of the plaintiff. Metropolitan Development is ordered to void all fraudulently obtained property transfers, restore original ownership to affected businesses, and pay punitive damages equal to 5 years of proven revenue for each affected business. The gallery erupted in tears and muffled cheers. Mrs. Park sobbed openly, hugging her daughter. Thomas Reynolds closed his eyes, relief washing over his face. But Judge Peterson wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the extensive nature of this fraud, I am referring this case to the State Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. Mr. Walsh, he turned to Metropolitan's lawyer, I suggest you advise your clients to cooperate fully. The Metropolitan executives, who had sat smugly through most of the trial, now looked shell-shocked. Their carefully constructed scheme had been dismantled by a teenager they had underestimated from the start. And finally, Judge Peterson removed his glasses, looking directly at Brian. Mr. Chen approached the bench. Brian walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the now quiet courtroom. "Young man, when you first walked into my courtroom, I made the mistake of judging you by your age rather than your capabilities. You have demonstrated not just an impressive understanding of the law, but something far more important, a deep commitment to justice. Your performance in this trial would have been remarkable for a seasoned attorney. For a 17-year-old high school student, it is nothing short of extraordinary." The judge smiled slightly. "I'm noting in the record my commendation of your preparation, professionalism, and ethical conduct throughout these proceedings. You've reminded everyone in this courtroom that justice isn't about age, experience, or power, it's about truth and the courage to fight for it." Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun bathed the steps in golden light as people spilled out of the building. News reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, but Brian's focus was on his grandfather. The old man stood quietly, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Grandfather," Brian said softly in Mandarin, "we did it. The restaurant is safe." His grandfather pulled him into a tight embrace. "You did more than save the restaurant," he replied. "You showed them that we matter, that our dreams matter." Mrs. Park approached them, still wiping her eyes. "My grocery store, I can reopen it," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "My daughter won't have to drop out of college to support us anymore." More people gathered around them, other business owners, community members, even some of the courthouse staff. Thomas Reynolds shook Brian's hand firmly. "You've given a lot of people hope today," he said. "And you've shown corporations that they can't get away with exploiting people anymore." Back in the courthouse corridor, Brian overheard two metropolitan executives arguing with their legal team. "We'll appeal," one insisted, but Walsh shook his head. "The evidence is too strong, and the publicity is destroying our reputation. Our shareholders are already calling for resignations." As the sun began to set, Brian gathered his materials one last time. His phone was flooded with messages, classmates, teachers, and even law schools expressing interest in his future applications. But the message that caught his eye was from his physics teacher: "Your lab report is still due tomorrow, but after what you've accomplished, I think we can give you an extension." That evening, the Chen family restaurant was filled with celebration. The regular customers who had supported them through the trial brought dishes to share, turning the victory into a community feast. The small dining room buzzed with conversation in multiple languages, united by the shared joy of justice served. Brian sat at a corner table, watching his grandfather move through the crowd, accepting congratulations and sharing stories. The old man seemed to stand taller now, the weight of fear lifted from his shoulders. A local newspaper reporter who had covered the trial asked Brian what he planned to do next. He looked around the restaurant, at the faded photographs on the walls showing 40 years of family history, at Mrs. Park teaching his sister how to fold dumplings, at Thomas Reynolds deep in conversation with other business owners about forming a community protection association. "This case was never just about winning," Brian replied. "It was about showing people that they don't have to be powerless, that one person standing up for what's right can make a difference. There are more metropolitan developments out there, more people who think they can take advantage of hard-working families. They need to know that someone will fight for justice." As the evening wore on, Brian slipped away to the kitchen, the heart of the restaurant where his grandfather had first taught him about persistence and dignity. He rolled up his sleeves and began washing dishes, just as he had done since he was tall enough to reach the sink. Tomorrow, he would return to being a high school senior with homework and college applications. But tonight had shown him his future path. In standing up against corporate fraud, he had found his calling, using the law to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Through the kitchen window, he could see the city lights twinkling like stars, each one potentially representing another family's dream. The verdict today hadn't just saved his grandfather's restaurant, it had sent a message that would echo through corporate boardrooms and immigrant communities alike: justice was possible, no matter how powerful the opponent. In the weeks following the verdict, the impact of Brian's victory rippled through the city like waves in a pond. The morning after the trial, he woke up to find his story on the front page of major newspapers. "Teen attorney exposes corporate fraud empire," read one headline. Another proclaimed, "David defeats Goliath, high school student wins landmark case." But the real changes were happening at street level. Metropolitan Development's carefully constructed facade began crumbling as more victims came forward. The state attorney's office had set up a special hotline for business owners who believed they had been targeted by similar schemes. The line rang constantly. One morning, as Brian helped his grandfather prep the restaurant kitchen before school, a news report caught their attention. Metropolitan's CEO had resigned, along with several board members. The company's stock was plummeting as investors fled from the toxic publicity. More importantly, other development corporations were frantically reviewing their practices, afraid of becoming the next Metropolitan. "You've started something big," his grandfather said, chopping vegetables with practiced precision. "But with big changes come big responsibilities." Those words proved prophetic. Brian's phone rang during lunch period at school. It was a community organizer from another city, asking for advice about fighting similar development schemes. By the end of the week, he had received calls from 6 different states. After school, Brian often found people waiting outside the restaurant, clutching property documents and hoping for help. He set up a small desk in the corner of the dining room, reviewing cases between homework assignments. His grandfather would bring tea to anxious families while they waited, sharing his own story of nearly losing everything. Thomas Reynolds had become a regular at these informal legal clinics. His whistleblower status had made finding new employment difficult, but he didn't regret his decision. Instead, he worked alongside Brian, using his insider knowledge to help identify fraudulent patterns in other cases. "You know," Thomas said one evening, reviewing documents with Brian, "what you did wasn't just win a case. You created a blueprint for fighting back. You showed people it's possible." The impact spread beyond property disputes. Other young people, inspired by Brian's example, began standing up to different forms of corporate misconduct. A 16-year-old in Detroit started investigating environmental violations. Twin sisters in Arizona began documenting wage theft at their parents' workplace. Mrs. Park's grocery store reopened with a celebration that brought the whole neighborhood together. She hung a framed photo of Brian's closing argument on her wall, next to her original business license. To remind everyone, she explained, that justice is possible if we're brave enough to fight for it. Brian's high school principal called him to her office one morning. "Universities are calling," she said, smiling. "They're interested in more than just your grades now. They want to know about your commitment to social justice." But success brought its own challenges. Some of Metropolitan's former executives had hired private investigators to dig into Brian's life, hoping to discredit him. They followed him to school, photographed his friends, and scrutinized his social media. But they found nothing to use against him, just a dedicated student who happened to care deeply about justice. One evening, as Brian sat doing his calculus homework at his usual corner table in the restaurant, a distinguished-looking woman in a suit approached him. She introduced herself as Justice Maria Rodriguez from the state Supreme Court. "I read the transcript of your case," she said, sitting down across from him. "You reminded me of why I became a lawyer in the first place." Sometimes, in the midst of complex legal theories, we forget that law is ultimately about protecting people. She looked around the busy restaurant, at the families enjoying their meals, the businesses that still stood because of Brian's efforts. We need more lawyers who understand that. Who are willing to fight for what's right, not just what's profitable. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several new families clutching property documents. Justice Rodriguez watched as Brian greeted them warmly, listening to their stories with genuine concern. "You've started something important," she said before leaving. "Don't let anyone tell you you're too young to make a difference. You've already proved them wrong." The impact of the case reached the state legislature, where new laws were being proposed to protect small businesses from predatory development practices. Some called it the Chen Act, though Brian found that embarrassing. He was more interested in the practical effects: stronger oversight, harsher penalties for fraud, and better protections for whistleblowers. One Saturday morning, Brian arrived at the restaurant to find a group of law students from the local university waiting for him. They had started a legal clinic inspired by his case, offering free assistance to small business owners facing corporate pressure. "We thought we needed fancy offices and expensive suits to make a difference," one of them explained. "You showed us that justice can start anywhere, even in a family restaurant." His grandfather, overhearing this, smiled proudly while preparing the day's dumplings. The restaurant had become more than just a business. It was a symbol of resistance against corporate greed, a gathering place for people seeking help and hope. The media attention eventually began to fade, but the changes Brian had sparked continued to grow. Other law firms, inspired by his example, started taking on similar cases pro bono. Community organizations began offering legal education workshops in multiple languages. The power dynamic between developers and small businesses was slowly shifting. Late one night, as Brian finished his college applications at his usual corner table, his grandfather sat down beside him. The restaurant was quiet, the last customers long gone. Through the window, they could see the city lights twinkling against the dark sky. "When I first came to this country," his grandfather said softly, "I believed in the American dream. But over the years, watching big companies push around small businesses like ours, I started to lose faith. You didn't just save our restaurant, grandson. You restored my faith in justice." Brian looked at the wall where his grandfather had hung the court verdict next to the original restaurant license. Between them now was a new addition, a collage of newspaper clippings about the case, surrounded by thank you notes from other business owners they had helped. "We did it together," Brian replied. "All of us. Every person who stood up, spoke out, and refused to be bullied. That's the real victory." Outside, the city was changing. Not just in the visible ways, the small businesses that still stood proud on their corners, but in the invisible ways that matter most. In boardrooms across the city, executives thought twice before targeting immigrant businesses. In law offices, young attorneys reconsidered their career paths. And in countless small shops and restaurants, people looked at their dreams with renewed hope, knowing that justice was possible. 1 year after the verdict, Brian stood at his high school graduation podium as valedictorian. The auditorium was packed, but his eyes found his grandfather immediately, the old man beaming with pride in the front row, sitting next to Mrs. Park and Thomas Reynolds, who had become like family over the past year. "When I started my senior year," Brian began, "I thought success meant getting perfect grades and into a good college. But life taught me a different lesson about what really matters." He paused, looking out at his classmates. "I learned that true success isn't about what you achieve for yourself, it's about what you do for others." The past year had transformed not just Brian, but the entire community. His grandfather's restaurant had evolved into something unexpected, part eatery, part community center, part legal aid clinic. The corner table where Brian had prepared for the trial now hosted regular workshops where lawyers volunteered their time to help small business owners understand their rights. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos, a group of young students from the local middle school approached Brian. They had started a youth advocacy group inspired by his story. "We're learning about business law," one excited 12-year-old told him. "Because you showed us we don't have to wait until we're grown up to make a difference." The impact of the Metropolitan case had spread far beyond their neighborhood. The state attorney's investigation had uncovered similar schemes across the country, leading to a nationwide crackdown on predatory development practices. The Chen Act had been adopted by several other states, with more following suit. Brian's college decision had surprised many. Despite offers from prestigious universities across the country, he chose to stay local, accepting a full scholarship to the City University's Law School Early Admission program. "My work here isn't finished," he explained to those who questioned his choice. That evening, the restaurant hosted a special celebration. The usual customers mingled with lawyers, activists, and community leaders who had become part of their extended family. On one wall, his grandfather had created a wall of justice, photographs of every business saved from predatory developers, their stories preserved as testament to the power of standing up for what's right. Thomas Reynolds, now running a successful consulting firm helping small businesses protect themselves from corporate fraud, raised his glass in a toast. "A year ago, we thought this was just about saving one restaurant. But it became about saving the soul of our community." Mrs. Park's daughter, home from college where she was now studying law herself, added, "Brian didn't just win a court case. He started a movement." The movement had indeed grown beyond anything they could have imagined. The informal legal clinics that started in the restaurant had spawned a network of community advocacy centers across the city. Other immigrant communities, inspired by their success, had organized their own legal defense funds. Corporate practices were changing too. Development companies, wary of becoming the next metropolitan, were reaching out to community leaders before starting projects. Some had even hired cultural liaison officers to work with immigrant businesses, a direct result of the public relations disaster Metropolitan had suffered. As the celebration continued, Brian slipped into the kitchen where his grandfather was preparing his famous dumplings. The familiar scene, steam rising from the pots, the rhythmic sound of chopping, brought back memories of all the evenings he'd spent here doing homework while learning life lessons from his grandfather's stories. "Do you remember," his grandfather asked, skillfully folding a dumpling, "what you said when you first told me you wanted to fight Metropolitan in court? You said, someone has to stand up to them. I was scared then, not of losing the restaurant, but of seeing you get hurt by them." Brian picked up a dumpling wrapper, his fingers remembering the motions taught to him years ago. "And now?" His grandfather smiled, the pride evident in his eyes. "Now I understand that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Justice Rodriguez, who had become a regular visitor and mentor to Brian. She carried a thick envelope. "The Bar Association wants you to speak at their annual conference," she said. "They think other lawyers could learn something about ethics and courage from a teenager." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same legal establishment that had initially dismissed Brian was now looking to him as an example of what the profession should aspire to be. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the kitchen was clean, Brian sat at his corner table one last time before leaving for college orientation the next day. The restaurant felt different now, not just a place of business, but a symbol of something larger. Through the window, he could see the lights of other small businesses along the street, Mrs. Park's grocery store, the Vietnamese bakery, the Indian textile shop. Each one represented a family's dreams, now protected by stronger laws and a united community. His phone buzzed with a message from a student group in another state asking for advice on fighting corporate exploitation in their community. These requests no longer surprised him, they were part of the continuing ripple effect of that first courageous stand. As he drafted his response, Brian reflected on how much had changed. Metropolitan development had become a case study in corporate ethics classes, their downfall a warning to others who would prey on vulnerable communities. But more importantly, their defeat had become a source of hope, proving that justice was possible even against the most powerful opponents. His grandfather emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of tea, a nightly tradition they had shared throughout the past year of changes and challenges. "Tomorrow you start a new chapter," the old man said, sitting down. But remember, every great journey starts with a single step taken in the right direction. Brian looked around the restaurant, at the wall of justice, the corner legal clinic, the tables where countless families had found help and hope. We did take the right step, didn't we? His grandfather nodded, sipping his tea. You did more than take a step. You showed others the path. Outside, the city hummed with life, each light in the darkness representing another family's American dream. Thanks to one teenager's courage to stand up for what was right, those dreams were now a little safer, a little more secure, a little more possible. The story of the teenage lawyer who defeated a corporate giant would be told for years to come. But its true impact wasn't in the headlines or legal textbooks, it was in the countless small acts of courage it inspired, in the communities it empowered, and in the change it sparked in how society viewed justice, age, and the power of standing up for what's right.